Hey everybody. I hope you guys have had a good week so far. We are almost through the school year. So one more week. Hang in there a little bit longer. You guys are almost done. I do want to mention before we get any further that Mrs. Hellman is going to be putting something at the end of the module for this for Thursday that she needs you guys to complete. It's about your schedule for next year, for eighth grade next year. So make sure you get that done for her so she has a better idea of how to get you into the classes you need. If you have any questions about it, let me know, let her know, and we'll be happy to help. But make sure you get that done soon. That way she has an idea of how to schedule you all for next year. So before we get started, we're going to move on to the other topic that I wanted to go over that I don't know we would have had time to normally, but worth mentioning. We're going to be looking at Australia. It's a very, very brief look at Australia. We're not going to go too much in depth into much of it, but just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of how Australia came to be where it is. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to do these four things: be able to explain who the Aborigines are, describe the discovery of Australia by European explorers, describe the system that Great Britain put in place to run their colony in Australia, and then discuss how Australia obtained its independence and where it's at in the world today. So first things first, we need to figure out where Australia is, which I feel like most of us have an idea, but if you're not entirely sure, Australia is in the southern Pacific Ocean, real close to New Zealand. It's a large island that's also its own continent. Due to just the size and where it's at, being the island that it is home to a lot of unique animal and plant life, as well as physical features and climates. I'm sure you're all aware of what this guy is. Koalas and kangaroos are some of the more well-known unique animals in Australia. There are hundreds of other ones probably that we don't have time to get into, but because of Australia's geography, being out in the ocean like it is, the plant and animal life is rather unique. So I mentioned physical features. Roughly 35% of the country's total land area is desert, with the majority being in the center part of the country. Oftentimes, we as Americans refer to that area as the outback. So if you ever hear someone say the Australian outback, they're talking about the center of Australia that's largely desert. Not entirely, but a good portion of it is desert, and roughly 35% of Australia is actually desert. So I mentioned Aboriginal people in the things we're going to talk about. So Aborigine is a name given to people we've given to people who are native to the continent of Australia. They're the ones who have been there the longest. We consider them to be native to the continent. It's estimated there are various different Aboriginal groups, tribes in Australia, and they've been on the continent anywhere between 60 and 80,000 years. The number changes depending on who you're talking to, but anywhere between 60 and 80,000 years have passed since the Aborigines first stepped foot on the continent. They're believed to be one of the few native groups in the world to maintain a nomadic system, a nomadic life into modern times. When I say nomadic, think about the Mongols, where they move from place to place, taking animals and other things with them. They don't have cities in the way we think of it. There is evidence of the Aborigine groups were able to develop agriculture, farming. So there is evidence that they did that, but a large portion of them maintain that nomadic style even into modern times. They've developed things that we're all fairly familiar with. If you've ever used a boomerang before, those were developed by Aborigine tribes for hunting. I'm not entirely sure how they worked exactly, but the Aborigines are the ones who developed the concept of a boomerang. They've also developed this instrument known as a didgeridoo. It's a kind of a cool thing to look at. Some people still use it. It's still being played in orchestras and all today, versions of it. But the original concept came from these native groups in Australia. It's estimated that at the time of Europeans' arrival in Australia in the 1780s, 1600s, 1700s, there were about 300,000 Aborigine peoples living on the continent of Australia. Today, they make up about 3% of Australia's population, which is about 23 million people today. And so that puts that number at about 690,000 Aborigine peoples living in Australia. So, as always, you've noticed anything we talked about at all this year, Europe shows up, changes everything, and Australia is not an exception to that. For much of its history, Australia was by itself, isolated, didn't have much contact, by geography reasons. They're an island on the ocean out in the middle of the Pacific, so they didn't have much contact with outside peoples. The first Europeans to arrive in Australia was a Dutchman by the name of William Hans in 1606. The Dutch didn't stick around, though. They were kind of just sailing through, exploring, found Australia. Guy wrote about it. But it wasn't until the arrival of British explorer James Cook in the 1770s that colonization of Australia began. James Cook took several expeditions into the Pacific, documented the entire coastline of Australia, I believe, established a few small colonies, nothing large, nothing major, but the interest in Australia for England was rather high, but the 1770s were a time of mixed issues in England. They had this issue come up here in the U.S. with the American Revolution, and so Australia was kind of put to the side for a little bit. They were still interested in Australia, but they were kind of caught up in the American Revolution, and so it wasn't until the 1788, so almost 20 years after James Cook arrived in Australia, that the British sent a guy by the name of Arthur Phillipps with the first wave of Australian settlers. But these people didn't come voluntarily. At this point in Britain's history, they had gone through an economic hardship. They had a lot of people arrested for theft. And so crowding in English prisons was extensive. And to kind of take the burden off the prison system in England, they took some of the prisoners, sent them to Australia, and basically, you live here now. This is your punishment for your crime. You're being shipped to Australia. And so originally, Australia was a British prison colony, meaning that the majority of the people who were Aborigine peoples were people who had been forced to come to Australia to serve out a prison sentence. It's estimated that between 1788, when Arthur Phillipps arrives, and 1868, roughly 168,000 of these people, these prisoners, were sent to Australia to serve out their prison sentences. So Australia's modern history, let's say, starts with Arthur Phillipps bringing the first wave of prison settlers to Australia in 1788. So for a while, up until the 1970s, Australia was run by the British government. They had their own internal government, but that government essentially reported to England. And as Australia began developing as a colony and later on its own, as its own country, it began expanding the territory under its control, which brought it into conflict with the Aborigine peoples. Oftentimes, the government went to extreme measures to acquire land from the Aborigines, including sometimes using force to do it. So tensions between the Aborigine peoples and the Australian government is rocky at best. But in 1998, the Australian government created a National Sorry Day. which was meant to formally apologize for the previous Australian government's treatment of the Aborigines. It's a recurring national holiday where people in Australia think about but like reflect on the way their government has treated the Aboriginal peoples, and it's an attempt to kind of make things right going forward. It's helped a little, but even today, land disputes between the Aborigines and the government are still hot topic issues in Australia's legislature. They're better, things are better, but they're still a little, they don't trust each other. So I mentioned Australia's independence. How did they get there? So in 1901, the different Australian states, the different portions of the Australian colony, joined together to create the Commonwealth of Australia. They wrote a constitution. They wrote all the things you would think you need for government. And that's why a lot of people think Australia became independent in 1901. It didn't. England still controlled Australia's foreign policy. The government of Australia still had to run appointments by England, by the Parliament in London. And so even during World Wars I and II, Australia sent troops to Europe to help Britain fight in both World Wars. And they also fought Japan in World War II. And they were fighting to save Australia because at the extent of the Japanese power in World War II, they were pushing towards a land invasion of Australia. There was a good chance that if things hadn't turned around in 1942-43, Australia would have been Japan's next target for invasion. It never got to that point, but after this, Australia realized that it needed to begin separating stuff from England. That way it could conduct its own foreign affairs, that kind of thing. So it wasn't they weren't able to do this until 1986, when Australia formally completed the stuff they need to do to make themselves an independent country. Today, Australia is a thriving modern country with an emerging tourism industry, and the common city that a lot of people think of when they think of Australia, myself included, is Sydney, and the Sydney Opera House, which you see here. So Australia has become a pretty important tourism industry or tourism sector, along with mining, agriculture, things we see in other modern countries. They have a mining industry, they have a manufacturing industry, they have all that stuff, but they also have a fairly large tourism industry as well. So here's what you'll be doing for today. The assignments under Canvas, the Australia module for the 14th. It'll be just like we've been doing the last few weeks. You short answer multiple choice questions. It'll be due May 18th, which is Monday at 8 a.m. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know via Canvas or email. And don't forget to finish that thing for Mrs. Hellman so she can help with your scheduling for next year. And other than that, I hope you all have a good weekend. I will see you on Monday.